The old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street had always been quiet, but now, it was suffocating silent. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson had lived there for 42 years, filling its creaky wooden floors with warmth, the scent of lavender tea, and the soft hum of her voice as she read aloud to her beloved cat, Muffin. But now the only sound left was the faint, broken mewling of the little gray tabby, curled up on her owner's favorite rocking chair, the one that no longer swayed with the rhythm of Mrs. Henderson's gentle rocking. Muffin had been crying for 3 days. The night Mrs. Henderson passed, Muffin had been nestled against her side, purring softly as the old woman stroked her fur with trembling fingers. "You're such a good girl, Muffin," she had whispered, her voice thin but full of love. "My sweet, sweet girl." Those were the last words Muffin ever heard from her. When the paramedics arrived, they had been gentle, moving with practiced care as they lifted Mrs. Henderson onto the stretcher. Muffin had watched, her green eyes wide and confused, tail flicking nervously as strangers filled the house with hushed voices and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Then the door closed, and her person never came back. Mrs. Calloway from next door was the first to realize something was wrong. She had brought over a casserole, the kind neighbors do when tragedy strikes, expecting to find Muffin perched on the windowsill, watching the world with her usual quiet curiosity. Instead, she found the cat hunched in the corner of the sofa, her fur matted from days without grooming, her tiny body trembling. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Calloway murmured, reaching out. Muffin flinched. She didn't hiss, didn't scratch, just let out a low, mournful sound, something between a whimper and a wail, before turning her face away. Over the next few days the other neighbors took turns checking in. Mr. Thompson from across the street left out fresh tuna. Young Emily Carter, who used to sneak Muffin treats when Mrs. Henderson wasn't looking, sat on the porch for hours, whispering soothing words. But Muffin didn't eat. She barely moved. She just cried. A sound so raw, so full of grief that it made Mrs. Calloway's chest ache. It wasn't the usual yowling of a hungry cat or the impatient meows of one demanding attention. This was different. This was loss. On the 4th day, when Muffin's cries had grown hoarse and her ribs were starting to show beneath her fur, Mrs. Calloway made a decision. "We have to take her to the vet," she told Mr. Thompson, her voice firm. "She's not just sad, she's wasting away." Muffin didn't fight as they carefully placed her in a carrier. She didn't even react when the car engine rumbled to life. She just sat there, her eyes dull, her tiny body curled into itself like she was trying to disappear. The vet, Dr. James Reynolds, had known Mrs. Henderson for years. She had been the one who brought Muffin in as a kitten, who never missed a checkup, who always asked with genuine concern, "Is she healthy? Is she happy?" Now, as he lifted Muffin onto the examination table, his heart clenched at the sight of her. "She's lost weight," he murmured, running his hands over her. "No injuries. No signs of illness. Just a cat who had given up." "She hasn't eaten since Eleanor passed," Mrs. Calloway said softly. "We've tried everything." Dr. Reynolds sighed, scratching behind Muffin's ears. "She didn't lean into the touch like she used to. Sometimes animals grieve just like we do," he said. "But this is extreme." Then, as he adjusted her collar, a simple blue one with a tiny silver bell, he noticed something odd. The fabric was thicker than it should have been. Frowning, he unhooked it. And that's when he saw it. A small, folded piece of paper, tucked carefully beneath the lining. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it. And then, oh my God! Dr. James Reynolds had seen grieving pets before. Dogs who refused to leave their owners' graves. Cats who sat by the door for weeks, waiting for someone who would never return. But Muffin, this small trembling tabby with her hollow eyes and ragged meows, was different. Her suffering wasn't just sadness. It was devastation. The fluorescent lights of the clinic hummed softly as Dr. Reynolds ran his hands over Muffin's frail body. She didn't resist, didn't even lift her head. Her breathing was shallow, her ribs too prominent beneath her dull fur. "No fever," he murmured, checking her ears. "No signs of infection." He listened to her heartbeat, steady but slower than it should be. "She's not sick," he said finally, looking up at Mrs. Calloway and Mr. Thompson, who stood anxiously nearby. At least, not in the physical sense. Mrs. Calloway twisted her hands together. Then why won't she eat? Why won't she stop crying? Dr. Reynolds sighed, stroking Muffin's head. Animals mourn. Some cats, especially ones as bonded as Muffin was to Mrs. Henderson, can literally die of a broken heart if they don't recover. Muffin let out a weak, shuddering meow as if confirming his words. As Dr. Reynolds went to remove Muffin's stethoscope, his fingers brushed against her collar, a simple blue fabric one with a tiny silver bell. He had seen it 100 times before. Mrs. Henderson had brought Muffin in every year for checkups, always making sure her collar was clean, her tag updated. But this time something felt off. The collar was thicker than usual. Frowning, he unhooked it and turned it over in his hands. The fabric was slightly bunched near the clasp as if something had been tucked inside. That's odd, he muttered. Mrs. Calloway leaned forward. What is it? Instead of answering, Dr. Reynolds carefully pried apart the stitching. And then he saw it. A folded slip of paper, yellowed with age, hidden deep within the collar's lining. His pulse quickened. The paper was fragile, as if it had been folded and refolded many times. Dr. Reynolds opened it with deliberate care, half expecting it to crumble in his fingers. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly smudged, unmistakably Mrs. Henderson's. His breath caught as he read. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Please take care of Muffin, she's all I have left. And tell her, her sister is waiting for her under the willow tree. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, oh my God, Dr. Reynolds whispered. Mrs. Calloway gasped. What does it say? Dr. Reynolds looked down at Muffin, who had lifted her head slightly, her green eyes fixed on the note as if she recognized the scent of the paper. Muffin had a sister, he said slowly. No one had ever known. Mrs. Henderson had never mentioned another cat. In all the years Muffin had been coming to the clinic, there had never been any sign of another pet. But the note didn't lie. Under the willow tree, Mr. Thompson repeated, his voice hushed. There's a big willow in Eleanor's backyard. Muffin let out a sudden, sharp cry, a sound so full of longing that Dr. Reynolds felt his throat tighten. She knows, he realized. She's not just grieving for Mrs. Henderson. She's grieving for her sister too. Then, like a puzzle piece clicking into place, Dr. Reynolds remembered something. Years ago, when Muffin was just a kitten, Mrs. Henderson had brought in 2 cats for their first checkup. 2 tiny gray tabbies nearly identical. This is Muffin, Mrs. Henderson had said, cradling one, and this is her sister, Button. Button. The name echoed in his mind. What happened to the other cat? Mrs. Calloway asked. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. I don't know. She stopped bringing Button in after a while. I just assumed. He trailed off. He had assumed the cat had passed away. But if that were true, why would Mrs. Henderson hide a note about her in Muffin's collar? Why would she say Button was waiting? Muffin's cries grew louder, more frantic, as if she understood they were talking about her sister. Dr. Reynolds made a decision. We need to check under that willow tree. Mrs. Calloway paled. You don't think? I don't know, he admitted. But if there's any chance this will help Muffin, we have to try. Muffin's paws kneaded weakly at the exam table, her claws catching in the paper beneath her. She wasn't just grieving. She was searching. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Reynolds carefully reattached Muffin's collar, his fingers lingering on the hidden note. How long had it been there? How long had Muffin carried this secret, this unspoken grief, without anyone knowing? And why had Mrs. Henderson kept it hidden? Muffin looked up at him, her eyes too old, too knowing. In that moment he understood. This wasn't just about losing an owner. This was about losing a family. The evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Dr. Reynolds, Mrs. Calloway, and Mr. Thompson hurried toward Mrs. Henderson's backyard, Muffin cradled gently in the vet's arms. The old willow tree stood at the far edge of the property, its long, sweeping branches swaying in the breeze like ghostly fingers reaching for the ground. Muffin had gone eerily still, her wide green eyes fixed on the tree. The grass beneath the willow was overgrown, tangled with ivy and wildflowers. Mrs. Calloway hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the small gardening trowel they had grabbed from the shed. "Do you really think?" Her voice wavered. Dr. Reynolds didn't answer. He set Muffin down carefully, watching as the cat took a few unsteady steps forward, her nose twitching. Then without warning she let out a sound, not a cry, not a meow, but something deeper. A wail of recognition. "There," Mr. Thompson whispered, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth near the base of the tree. The three of them exchanged a glance before kneeling. Mrs. Calloway dug first, the trowel slicing through soft soil. Then, oh! Her breath hitched. Buried just beneath the surface was a tiny, weather-worn wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. The wood was warped with age, the edges softened by years of rain and time. Muffin pressed against Dr. Reynolds' leg, her body trembling. With careful hands he lifted the box. It was lighter than he expected. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded blue fabric, were two things. 1. A small, frayed red ribbon, the kind used for cat collars. 2. A photograph. The image was old, the colors washed out, but the subjects were unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson, years younger, smiling as she cuddled two tiny gray tabbies in her lap. Muffin, smaller, brighter-eyed, and beside her, another cat. Nearly identical, except for one detail, a red ribbon tied around her neck. "Button," Dr. Reynolds murmured. The memory came back to him in fragments. Mrs. Henderson had brought both kittens in for their first vaccinations. Muffin had been the bolder of the two, curious and playful, while Button had been shy, clinging to her sister. Then one day the visit stopped. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Henderson had told him during one of Muffin's checkups, her eyes glistening. "Button, she's gone." At the time he had assumed the kitten had passed away, maybe an illness, maybe an accident. But now, holding the box, he wondered, why bury a ribbon and a photo? Why not a body? Muffin pawed at the box, her claws catching on the fabric inside. She sniffed the ribbon, then let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a sob. "She remembers," Mrs. Calloway said softly. Dr. Reynolds turned the photograph over. On the back, in Mrs. Henderson's handwriting, was a date, 15 years ago, and 3 words. "Forgive me, Button." A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just a memorial. This was a confession. The pieces fell together slowly, painfully. Mrs. Henderson had loved both cats. But Button had been sick. Something congenital, something untreatable. Dr. Reynolds hadn't seen it at first, but now he remembered. The way the kitten had always been smaller, weaker. The way her breathing had sometimes sounded labored. She hadn't disappeared. She had been let go. And Mrs. Henderson, unable to bear the guilt, had hidden the truth, even from Muffin. But cats don't forget. Muffin had spent years searching for her sister, sensing her absence in the way the house felt too quiet, in the way Mrs. Henderson's hands sometimes shook when she petted her. And now, with her owner gone, the grief had split wide open. Muffin curled around the box, her body folding over it as if she could shield it from the world. She didn't cry, didn't meow. Just pressed her face into the ribbon and breathed in, one last time, the scent of her sister. Then slowly she stood and walked away. Dr. Reynolds closed the box carefully, his throat tight. Mrs. Calloway wiped her eyes. All these years, she never knew what happened. "She knew," Dr. Reynolds corrected softly. "She just needed to see it." Muffin sat at the base of the willow, her back to them, her tail wrapped around her paws. For the first time since Mrs. Henderson's passing, she was silent. The golden light of dusk filtered through the willow's weeping branches as Dr. Reynolds carefully placed the small wooden box back into the earth. The ribbon and photograph inside carried 15 years of unspoken grief, Mrs. Henderson's secret, now laid bare. Muffin sat motionless a few feet away, her green eyes reflecting the fading sun. She had stopped crying, stopped meowing. But the silence was heavier than any sound she could have made. Mrs. Calloway brushed dirt from her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think there's more here?" Dr. Reynolds studied the ground beneath the willow. The earth was uneven, subtly disturbed in a way that suggested something lay beneath, not just the box but something deeper. "We should look," he said. Mr. Thompson fetched a shovel from the shed, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the weight of the moment. The first thrust into the soil was met with resistance, not rock but something else. Something deliberately placed. A few inches down, the shovel scraped against smooth stone. Dr. Reynolds knelt, brushing away the dirt to reveal a flat, oval-shaped river rock, its surface worn smooth by time. It wasn't natural to the soil, it had been put there. A marker. Muffin crept forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the stone. Then she did something none of them expected. She pressed her forehead against it and let out a single, shuddering sigh. "Oh God!" Mrs. Calloway choked out, covering her mouth. Dr. Reynolds didn't need to dig further to know what lay beneath. This was where Button rested. The memories came to Muffin in flashes. Scents, sensations, the ghost of a tiny body curled against hers in sleep. She had searched for Button for years. Sniffed corners of the house where her sister once napped. Stared at closed doors, waiting for them to swing open under Button's small paws. She had known. Cats always know. But Mrs. Henderson had never spoken of it, and Muffin had never stopped looking. Until now. As the group stood in quiet reverence, Dr. Reynolds pieced together the final fragments of the story. Button had been sick, not just frail but suffering. Mrs. Henderson, faced with the unbearable choice of watching her fade in pain or letting her go peacefully, had chosen mercy. But the guilt had lingered. She had buried Button beneath the willow, the same tree where the kittens used to chase sunlight dappling through the leaves. She had kept the red ribbon, the photograph, the truth locked away in a box, unable to voice what she had done. And Muffin, left without answers, had grieved in silence. Muffin lay down beside the river rock, her body curled in a half-moon around it. She didn't meow, didn't cry, just closed her eyes and rested her chin on the earth, as if finally listening to something the humans couldn't hear. Mrs. Calloway sniffled. She's saying goodbye. Dr. Reynolds swallowed hard. Or hello. The wind rustled the willow's leaves, carrying with it the faintest chime of a bell, Muffin's collar stirring as she exhaled. For the first time in days her breathing was deep, peaceful. As twilight settled, Dr. Reynolds carefully replaced the soil over the box and the river rock. They would mark the spot properly later. A small plaque, perhaps, with Button's name. But for now this was enough. Muffin stayed there until the last sliver of sun vanished, her tail flicking once as if swatting away an old ghost. Then, slowly, she stood and walked toward the house, not with the frantic desperation of before, but with quiet purpose. She paused at the back steps, glancing over her shoulder at the willow one last time. Then she went inside. No one expected what happened next. Muffin padded straight to her food bowl, ignored for days, and ate. Not a tentative nibble. Not a reluctant bite. A full, deliberate meal, crunching through kibble with the steady rhythm of a cat who had finally laid down a weight too heavy to carry. Mrs. Calloway burst into tears. Dr. Reynolds, watching from the doorway, felt his own eyes burn. Some goodbyes weren't endings. They were the start of healing. Dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold as Muffin sat beneath the willow tree one last time. The morning dew clung to her fur like tiny diamonds, and the air smelled of earth and fresh rain. She had spent the night curled beside the river rock, her body a living monument to the sister she had never stopped loving. Now, as sunlight filtered through the leaves, she rose, slowly, deliberately, and pressed her nose to the cool stone. A final goodbye. Mrs. Calloway found her there, sitting upright, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. For the first time since Mrs. Henderson's passing, Muffin's eyes were clear, no longer clouded with grief but sharp, present. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Calloway murmured, kneeling beside her. "Are you ready to come home?" Muffin blinked up at her, then turned her gaze back to the willow. A breeze rustled the branches, sending a shower of leaves fluttering to the ground. One landed on the river rock, and Muffin nudged it gently with her paw before stepping away. She was ready. Mrs. Calloway's house was smaller than Mrs. Henderson's, but it was warm, filled with sunlight and the scent of baking bread. She had prepared a corner just for Muffin, a plush bed, a bowl of fresh water, and a framed photograph on the wall. Muffin and Button as kittens, side by side in Mrs. Henderson's lap. Muffin investigated every inch of the room before settling onto the bed. She sniffed the photograph, then touched it lightly with her nose. "She'll always be part of you," Mrs. Calloway whispered, stroking her head. Muffin purred, a quiet, rumbling sound like distant thunder. Every evening after that, Muffin would sit by the window watching the willow tree sway in the distance. Mrs. Calloway didn't try to stop her. She understood. Some bonds couldn't be broken, not even by death. And then one day Muffin didn't go to the window. She climbed onto Mrs. Calloway's lap instead, kneading the blanket absently before curling into a ball. Mrs. Calloway held her breath, afraid to move. Muffin sighed, a deep, contented sound, and closed her eyes. The weeks passed and Muffin's ribs disappeared beneath healthy fur. She played with toy mice, batted at sunbeams, and even tolerated Mrs. Calloway's yappy terrier, Max, who adored her instantly. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Muffin would pause, her ears twitching as if listening to something far away. And once, on a particularly warm afternoon, Mrs. Calloway swore she saw Muffin flick her tail at nothing, the way cats do when greeting another. On the anniversary of Mrs. Henderson's passing, Mrs. Calloway tied a red ribbon around the willow's trunk, the same shade as Button's collar. Muffin sat beside her, watching in silence. Then she leaned forward and rubbed her cheek against the ribbon, marking it with her scent. A message. A memory. A family forever intertwined. Cats don't grieve like humans. They don't weep. They don't speak. But they remember. And in the end that was enough. This story was inspired by the profound bonds between pets and their humans, and the quiet, enduring love they carry even after loss. If you've ever loved and lost a pet, you know that grief is just love with nowhere to go. Muffin's journey is a reminder that love never truly fades. It simply changes shape. Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe my channel. Watching more videos, remember,